Thanks, Richard, and thanks, everyone. I can formally say now good afternoon, so that's quite good. I've been granted the perfect presentation slot, not the first one in the morning where people haven't been warmed up, not the last one of the day, but the one before lunch. So I promise to try and finish on time, so I know how important lunch is. I'd like to thank BALEAP for inviting me and all the local Sheffield organisers for doing such sterling work and keeping me to time as well. Deadlines are not my strength. What I'd like to do in my talk today is to consider a couple of fundamental questions. So as EAP professionals, what is it that we do and what is it that we hope to achieve? So no pressure there with the big questions. The talk is grounded in a concern that EAP professionals, and I think more widely English language teaching professionals more generally, have often felt themselves to be somewhat professionally marginalised in comparison to other university lecturers and arguably to a degree to school teachers as well. And this marginalisation is often perceived in terms of things like salary, job prospects, job security, and unprofessional standing as well. So what I'm hoping to do within this talk is to think of a new way of conceptualising what we do and what we hope to achieve. And with the intention of perhaps levelling the playing field between English as academic purposes, professionals and colleagues in other academic departments. And I want to do this through a particular lens, and that's the lens of academic repertoire. And I'm hoping that this conversation can be the beginning of a kind of a discursive space where we consider ways in which due respect is paid to EAP in terms of its profession and not viewed as something that's marginal to the overall university project. Okay, so where does this marginalisation come from? Well, I think part of it comes from a hangover from the crude stereotype of the 70s and 80s backpacking EFL teacher. I'm in no way doing those people down. I was one of those people 31 years ago. And I think it's a stereotype that also has been played up to more recently by some commercial travel companies. Here's one I've found there, it's well worth Googling actually, that present this image of the English language teacher as an opportunity to travel, an opportunity to see the world as well. This one in particular described itself as a community of TEFL teachers who share a passion for backpacking, volunteering and teaching. It's a very interesting ordering of those things, I thought. So it's great. If you go on the website, there's pictures of people going down water slides, whitewater rafting. There's no pictures of anyone in the classroom whatsoever. And presenting teachers in this way, and I think that kind of image there of the young woman there with a small class of children there, contrasts with the way that school teachers, state school teachers are presented as qualified, with qualified teaching status and being appropriately professional. I notice she's wearing goggles, which I've rarely done in the classroom. I'd argue that such crude stereotypes ignore the experience, the qualifications and the scholarship of our field, but they're unfortunately still associated with EFL and EAP in the minds of some of our colleagues who are unfamiliar with the context in which we work. I also want to argue that to a degree this marginalisation can be viewed as institutional, and apologies to Richard for using your web page here. I think there's a growing tendency in some, though not all, universities to locate EAP as part of student services. So I've highlighted that bit there, you can see. As part of student services or academic skills services, as opposed to activity which is located in more academic departments. And I think that's part of a process of othering EAP activity from real academia. It's not just in terms of the location, I think that's in terms of the administration quality assurance as well. So in my university, the English Language Teaching Centre comes under the auspices of the Board of Extra Faculty Provision, which Richard and I are both members of. And I think that's an interesting formulation of the terms. The extra stands for not additional, but it means from outside. Okay? So again, it's further isolating it from the standard academic structure. And I think that that extra faculty notion is potentially a marginalizing construal as well. Okay, it's not a new phenomena, I would argue. Leslie Sheldon picks this up in his book, Directions in the Future, sort of 11 years ago now. But the way that EAP has been marginalized in terms of the academic research community within universities. And I think it's worth noting that academic research that's conducted by EAP professionals outside the faculty structure is very rarely included in things like the Research Excellence Framework. I know Diane's going to pick up more on this in terms of how research in EAP can be more outward-facing. But it's about the recognition for the important research that EAP professionals do. Ursula Wingate from King's College in London argues that EAP is both trivialized and marginalized by others within the system. So she talks about it being trivialized by treating the discourses of academic specialisms as all the same and equating grammatically correct everyday language with the more nuanced communication requirements of individual fields of expertise. She talks about it being marginalized as well by separating language instruction from subject instruction, and by this implying that, that language instruction is in some way subordinate to content instruction. And I think that's part of this ongoing construal that EAP departments are subordinate to academic subject departments. And that's something that I feel quite angry about at times. Okay, so perhaps if we can just switch to some pedagogical issues, some issues and some insights that have come out of learning theory, I suppose. You probably be familiar with Jim Cummings' quite seminal work on the differentiation between BICS and CALP, basic interpersonal communication skills and cognitive academic language proficiency. So it talks about BICS being this basic communication fluency, the language of informal settings, and contrasting that with CALP, the ability to use language in more sophisticated manners, in using abstraction, and the ability to use language as a tool for learning. And this is the kind of language that I assume he's talking about, the kind of language that university students need. Now, that research is quite well known, but there's a couple of parts of that research that I think have been glossed over for a lot of people. One of the things he said in that research was that it takes 5 to 7 years to acquire CALP in the second language if the learner has native language literacy. That's a long time, isn't it? 5 to 7 years. Learners who don't have a strong native language often need 7 to 10 years to acquire CALP in the second language. Now, I think there's some implications to those statements, those claims, and if they're true, what does that say for what we offer in terms of EAP programs? And more importantly, what are the time constraints that EAP professionals work under drive EAP practice to become? Okay? And that includes institutional pressures to show what we're doing, to show progress, to show success. I would question whether that very limited time available to us forces EAP professions very often into a more instrumental approach, or a training and transmission kind of mindset. In terms of learning theory, back in 1979, two Swedish educational psychologists, Roger Saljo and his colleague Ferenc Martin, started working thinking about different conceptions of learning. And they've come up with a very commonly used formulation of surface and deep learning. And this work has been followed on by other kind of very important, I'd argue, learning theorists like John Biggs and Paul Ramsden in Australia. So they're differentiating between these two conceptions of learning and having different characteristics. So they're talking about surface learning as being things like memorization, rote learning, concentrating narrowly on the detail, and interestingly, motivated by a fear of failure. They contrast that with the deep learning that I think we are trying to inculcate in our students, which is much more of a vigorous interaction with content, taking a broad view, being motivated by interest rather than fear, and taking time to read beyond the subject. Okay? So Sayo and Martin have argued that this training approach to pedagogy can lead only to the surface type of learning here, and that's not appropriate to the kind of deep and critical learning that's required for success in higher education. In terms of that sort of focus on surface learning as well, another learning theorist, David Bowd, has written quite powerfully, I think, about conceptions of learning as learning things, okay? That are skills to be acquired, chunks of knowledge to be memorized, and so on. And he argues that that comes from a very surface learning mindset, and one that's got a more, I suppose, more focused, more sophisticated form of surface learning, which they term instrumental learning. Instrumental learning is learning for the test and nothing beyond that. Bowd's also written about metaphors of learning, which I think is quite interesting. This article was not focusing so much on learning in general, but on concepts of professional development for teachers. And he argues that the metaphors that we use all the time are actually unhelpful. Okay? So he says when we talk about things like acquiring learning or transferring learning, they seem to strike a chord with what we understand. But he argues that they only strike a chord is because they're used so frequently, they're so ubiquitous across all levels of education. And for a lot of people, when they're confronted with Bowd's argument that these are just metaphors, okay, it becomes part of a shock. But they are metaphorical, and they have become part of everyday discourse because of their ubiquity. I rail in the university when I hear colleagues, particularly in senior meetings, talking about delivery of education. It drives me mad. Yeah? It's because it's so resonant of a transmission approach to pedagogy, which is counter to everything we know about learning theory. I'm interested in thinking about the way this sort of argument links to a common notion in English language teaching that's been part of our profession, I'd argue, for decades now, of moving away from learning as product to learning as process. Okay, so I think we're ahead of the game. Okay, instrumental learning. Okay, so the question becomes, what is the focus on skill acquisition and using metaphors that focus on skill acquisition, mastering tasks and being coached to meet assessment? Does that actually prepare our students for what they need to do? And that transmission metaphor, I think, summed up by that cartoon as well. Is that kind of approach to pedagogy one that's either desirable or in fact credible at all? There are also more politically oriented arguments which challenge kind of instrumental and more surface approaches. Jürgen Habermas in the 1980s talked about instrumental learning as a means to consume, compartmentalize and regurgitate information. So very much a kind of a product notion there. And he linked that also with the fact that products are things you can sell. Blazinski argues quite differently that that's not the way we should be thinking about what we do, and that in postmodern society individuals need to be able to think and act much more dynamically than that. I think it's part of a broader performative agenda. In his classic work, The Postmodern Condition, the French philosopher, French post-structuralist philosopher, Jean-François Lyotard, argues that previous meta-narratives, or the way we think about the world, has moved through history from post-Enlightenment searches for truth, through kind of Marxist notions of a search for emancipation, to an age where now meta-narratives are largely bankrupt, the end of meta-narratives. And he argues that the condition that we live in now is one which he terms performativity, which is one where only things that are measurable, only measurable outputs are things that we value. Excuse me. And he'll argue that that's kind of legitimated in examples that we see around us all the time in education. So you think of school league tables. Academic articles are now judged on a 1 to 4 star rating, okay, which causes bizarre discussions in university departments. The Research Excellence Framework assesses university research output on 1 to 4 star rating. And there are lots of other examples of the use of metrics metrics as assessment criteria. So even think about things like giving students grades on presentations. Targets is another area as well. Now, I think that conception is rather an impoverished one, and it's challenged, I think, it's best summed up by a quotation that's often ascribed to Albert Einstein. I'm not sure whether Albert Einstein ever said this, because I can't find it anywhere on the internet, but lots of people think he said it, which is not everything that counts can be counted, and not everything not everything that can be counted counts. And that's interesting. You know, how do we measure motivation? How do we measure love of a subject? Donald Shern as well has talked about in HE this kind of way of thinking as being dominant, and his term for that was the high hard ground of technical rationality, which has become ubiquitous. So thinking apart from the Research Excellence Framework, the Green Paper was launched last week for a parallel teaching excellence framework, which is going to be largely judged on metrics again. And promotion in university departments being largely based on publication outputs and the hideous term grant capture. Okay. So what does this do to teachers, and what does it do to EAP teachers? Okay. Well, what it does, I think, is it fits discourses of accountability. Okay. You can measure something. You can hold people to that. Have they met their targets and so on. But what it does, the impact it has, is certain ways of knowing and certain forms of knowledge are being legitimized and recognized, whereas others are not. And you can think over the last sort of 30, 40 years how that's had an impact across the whole sphere of education. So things like the introduction of prescribed national curricula, with the argument that teachers now, all they have to do is teach to the curriculum. They're told what's important, and it removes professional autonomy and makes them much more like educational technicians. As Brian calls it, teachers are the vehicles, not the motors of improvement. And critics of performativity, like Sir Ken Robinson and Alfie Kohn in the States, argue that the teaching to the test culture stifles creativity, creates pupils who are less interested in learning and have less enthusiasm for tackling challenging tasks and are less creative and able to think for themselves. I had a great example of this. I do some teaching on a distance learning program in Singapore, and the students, it's a Masters of Education, the students are all lecturers. And one of them told me that in Singapore, you are paid on a 13-month basis. You get a monthly salary, and the 13th is a bonus. But the bonus is entirely dependent on student satisfaction. So at the end of every session, students fill in a card, 1 to 5, on how well you've done. And if you don't get 80% or less, if you don't get 80% or more, you don't get your 13-month bonus. And they talked about what that's done to pedagogical practice. What that does is it stops them introducing anything that's challenging or difficult or uncomfortable for students. It stops them engaging in activities that might create the cognitive conflict that's essential to deep learning. And what they do is sort of education or entertainment education. So it's a problem. Okay. So what can we do? Okay. Well, I think one way we can do it is start to think about these issues and start to challenge some of the metaphors that we use and think about the ways in which we conceptualize what we do and what we want to do. Yeah. Okay. So for many years, English language teaching in general, and EAP in particular, has been characterized by this very narrow focus and the ubiquity of the term skills. This isn't an anti-skills talk. Okay? Skills have their place, but they are not everything, as you'll see as my talk develops. Okay. But classically, we'll see that those things are are named as areas like reading, writing, speaking, listening, understanding. They're mirrored in high-stakes assessment, as you'll know. So there's an anonymized IELTS one. You'll notice the grading is all around those 4 skills. There's a TOEFL one, the same kind of thing in the far corner there. Again, the assessment systems are reinforcing that focus on skills there as well. Okay, but there has been, throughout the literature, and quite substantive literature, quite cogent critiques, I think, of that segregated skills approach, where you're separating substantive academic work from a skills kind of approach. And we see much more commonly within EAP attempts now to integrate academic work that is genuine and authentic for students, where they're going to have to go after they leave pre-sessional courses, and in-sessional courses being run in conjunction with departments as well. But unfortunately, I say, of that restricted lens of a focus simply on skills and support has become a lens through which other colleagues and senior management might view the EAP community again, if they're not familiar with the amazing things that the profession does. So what's higher education all about then? Well, Pare's argued that part of what you do in higher education pedagogy is part of an enculturation process. Okay? So it's a process through which students learn more about the academic community they're joining, about its past, its debates, its cultural discourse practices as well. So to use John Swales' terms, it is, or at least it should be, an induction into an academic discourse community. Okay? So I want to argue that the thesis in the talk is that we need to recharacterize our professional practice away from the simple notion of language upskilling and much more into this idea of preparing potential and actual HE students to be successful members of those academic communities. And in doing that, I've drawn on a very interesting revisiting of an old concept in Blommaert and Bacchus's articulation of the notion of repertoire. Okay? And I want to argue that by focusing on our roles as the developers of repertoires, we're emphasizing the personal development, the capacity building that I think is essential to higher education pedagogy, rather than simply jumping through the hoops of passing tests. Okay, so this is a concept whereby students are not simply trained in academic English, but they're invited into that discourse community, and they are critically included as part of a broader academic community, not simply international students. There was a campaign a couple of years ago in the university here, run by the Students' Union, and its key message was, we are all international students. Okay? We may be born in the country in which we study, but our research, our study has international impacts as well. And this becomes part of a situation where our job is not simply about skilling up students, but helping them to develop repertoires that help them either to become members of a successful academic community or professionally trained in the norms of those particular areas. Okay, so repertoire has got a long history in sociolinguistics. It's a well-recognized body that's been circulated for a number of decades around this, and it's associated with American linguists like John Joseph Gumpertz and Del Hymes. And it talks about the linguistic repertoire as being all the things that go on within a speech community. Okay? And the fact that people don't just use one dialect, one register, one genre, one style. They mix, they blend, they hybridize these kinds of things. And on the basis of that, the notion of communicative competence develops, whereby it's the ability to apply language appropriately in different speech situations. Now, I think that's what EAP tries to do. It's a competent speaker can use and apply registers and styles and genres in different situations for different intentions. Okay. The value, I think, of repertoire is that it focuses on the language user, not just the language use as well. And as such, there are links with the kind of deep learning I was mentioning earlier on as well. So Blommet and Backus talk there about kind of the resources that enter into a repertoire indexical. I'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment. But social resources. And they allow us to think about the way in which individuals want to present themselves, not just simply a focus on language competence as well. And these seem highly relevant to me to student development, if as I think we want them to become informed, articulate members and critical members of the academic discourse community. Okay, so there's academic hoop jumping. So what does a repertoire consist of? Well, at this stage now, I don't know whether, perhaps I should be presenting a list, but I'm going to argue I can't present a list. Okay. Because academic repertoires will differ in different contexts and different disciplines. Okay? And also, in kind of the modern situation in which we live, there's increasing emphasis on transdisciplinary work, interdisciplinary work across departments, even in areas of research. A key notion is this idea of co-production, where it's not researchers going in, parachuting in and passing on the benefits of their wisdom, but they're working with communities to design and disseminate research outputs as well. I think academic repertoires is certainly more than a measurable list of competences. So doesn't sit comfortably with a performativity agenda. And I think where Blommet and Backus have taken this beyond kind of the Himes and the Gumpert's original sociolinguistic notion is that they're talking about today's super diversity context. That's their term. Yeah? So learners engage with a wide variety of networks, of groups of people, of communities and different resources, and they learn these through a range of tactics, of technologies and trajectories. So by their nature, they are quite individual. They also talk about different learning modes lead to different kinds of degrees of knowledge. So what a repertoire becomes is a patchwork of competencies, skills, dispositions and values. You'll see skills is in there, so skills is part of a repertoire. Okay? And they also talk about repertoires as being biographical. This indexical biographies talks about your repertoire defines or becomes an expression of who you are, where you come from, and what you bring to your subject study. So repertoires reflect individual subjectivities. So that's why a taxonomy is difficult to produce for these kinds of things. Okay. So to sum up, then academic repertoires, I'd argue, are individual in nature, and individual students have a different profile of needs as well. And this points to, I think, a refocus on the notion of the analysis of needs. Now, needs analysis has been fairly central to EAP for decades. But Sarah Benesch and others have criticized traditional notions of EAP, of needs analysis in EAP, as being rather descriptive and assuming taxonomies of needs are natural and neutral and applicable to all students. She's argued, Sarah Benesch has argued, for a critical reconsideration of needs analysis. So she talks about critical needs analysis. And what she argues as well is that needs analysis has avoided questions about unequal power distribution within the workplace and within academia. So allowing institutional requirements to dominate, but justifying that through the use of terms like pragmatism and authenticity. She also argues that the pre-specification of learning needs from outside experts doesn't fit very well with notions of professional autonomy and agency. And this is something that David Bowd has also followed up in more generally in terms of learning theory as well. So I'm going to go through that quite quickly. I think the slides will be available to you as well. But she argues that taxonomies of needs hide their ideological kind of basis. And in her article, she refers to Pauline Robinson's very well-known book of ESP Today, saying that when you have aspects of the taxonomy, like what are the user institution regards as necessary, contrasted with what students themselves want to gain, they are not on an equal footing. Okay? That what the institution desires is often paramount to what the student wants. And there's also the question within that about, do students know what they need at that stage? And one way of thinking about this, I thought, is with the National Student Survey, which is a very crude measure of student satisfaction. It's become dominant in the discourse of academic departments. It's really considered important. You treat your students like crap for 2 years, and in the third year you're really nice to them, so you get a good NSS score. But that idea then of, it's a discourse of the learning experience is deemed as more important than the learning itself. Okay. So critical needs analysis becomes not about just a top-down imposition of what the institution thinks student needs, but it's going beyond, and it's also going beyond asking students what they need as well. Okay? But it's an understanding of the issues, debates, positions, and also, Banesh argues, quite importantly, students being provided with the potential to critically challenge within their field. So it's not just a training inculcation, it's part of genuinely introducing them to being members of the academic discourse community. And what this involves is two things, I'd argue. One is the construction of discursive spaces where you can talk about these things, and secondly, the repertoire to be able to do that as well. Okay. Crucially, I would say that this approach is not an imposition, and Harley and Haywood have noticed here that advocacy for the critical approach to needs analysis here, that the agency always remains with the student as well. Okay, there's a quote. It's probably quite well known, and I think I've highlighted certain terms within there that seem to suggest, well, rather neatly, I think it fits with the reconception of EAP as academic repertoire as well. And a brief example of where I think this has been done, okay, comes from work from the University of Nottingham's Ningbo campus in China, where Peter Livray talks about the move within their EAP provision from a push system, where the support that students needed was predetermined by the institution, to a pull system, where students are provided with a range of resources and they can select what they need, when they need it, obviously with the advice of their academic tutors as well. Peter Livray argues, I think quite convincingly in this article, that the problems of trying to anticipate demand and providing prefabricated solutions to possible problems are features of a push system. But the advantages of a pull system are much more about the increased flexibility, and these are much more pertinent to students in the different options that they might choose to take as well. So it's about, once again, making sure that EAP is much more kind of responsive to student needs in certain ways as well. Okay, so you all start throwing things at me. This is what I think this view of pedagogy isn't. Okay. In no way is it a denial of the expertise, experience, knowledge, understanding of EAP professionals. In fact, I think it's the opposite. Okay? I think it's a mechanism by which we can say the important work we do is as important as the work that goes on in departments, and challenge that marginalization of EAP. Okay. It's not a denial of the high-stakes nature of much of the assessment in EAP. It's not, we get rid of IELTS tomorrow. IELTS can be perfectly useful. It can be pragmatic. It can be something students want. But it's part of an overall academic repertoire. It's not, or it shouldn't be, the be-all and end-all as well. It's also not a denial of the power of institutional constraints on this, but an opportunity, I would say, to argue that what goes on within EAP is as important. It's central. And it's not a face threat to EAP professionals who are not located within academic departments again. And I think overall it links with Blomat's notion of indexical biographies. It's about who students are, where they come from, and what they bring. So just to finish off, closing thoughts. I think that EAP should be viewed as much more than the delivery of a measurable set of competences, and much more than just a support for students. It's central to the academic project. Okay? And it shouldn't be viewed as being subordinate to real academic departments. I think that what we do, the EAP professionals, work transdisciplinary. In terms of transdisciplinary, meaning you start with an issue and you draw insights from different disciplines to deal with that issue. It's research informed, okay, and we are probably amongst the most culturally agile members of the university community, I'd argue. I hope that we can reassert through this understanding and transmission of this view of the case for EAP as being professionally status equal to other university departments. Okay, so finally, I think it's reconceptualizing EAP as academic repertoire has two purposes for me. Okay? The first one, helping our students to develop what they need to be successful in higher education. Okay? And simultaneously, for our profession, advancing the argument that we mustn't be consigned to the margins of institutional academia. You've been very patient, so I'm going to finish with two pictures. The first one is what we want, what I think academic repertoire can provide us with, some lovely engaged students. The second one is what we risk if we don't adopt this. And that's students who, for one reason or another, don't have the resources to do what they need to do. So anyway, thank you very much.